Thank you all for being here. This today is an international event. We have people from South Africa, from Germany, from Palestine, and from the United States online. And I'm really happy that you all gathered for this important topic. Our today's topic is actually to discuss the topic of apartheid. And Adila is our speaker from South Africa with her experience of apartheid structures. She has actually done such an event before and somehow inspired us to do it this year. And in the beginning of this event, I just want to mention that for today's event, we are collecting some donations.
Wir sammeln Spenden.
The donation link here in the link, I will just post it. Just a second. Yes, and so the main focus of today's event is actually to discuss which or why one could adapt the apartheid structures of South Africa to the state of Palestine and its ongoing occupation. For this, we invited today Mr. Miko Pellet, who's an international speaker, author of two brilliant books, which I really can advertise and suggest to read. They really allow a very wide perspective on diverse perspectives on, what is injustice and how he himself actually became a Palestinian activist, being actually from the occupied state's perspective. Like, what does it take you to overcome your social environment, your understanding of being within the Israeli environment, and to question the state of Palestine. And yeah, so I think we are ready to go. There's just a little thing in the chat. The second translator cannot unmute. So what are we supposed to do? Maybe, okay, just a second. Okay, I hope this works now. Sometimes, like in each event, we have to figure out the technical things because they take a little bit of time and to figure out how things work. Because today's event, actually, you can choose to either hear it in German or in English, since we have two brilliant people who are willing to translate from English into German. And I want to shout out to them and thank them for their work and effort in advance. Yes, I think we should just jump into the topic. Maybe before we start, I know there are perhaps many questions, but just to maintain a structure in the beginning, we will hear Adila and referring in her experience of apartheid and what she's going to tell us about South Africa. And then Mr. Pellet will be representing the apartheid perspective on Palestine. And by the end of the discussion, we will talk about why it's so important to speak of apartheid within Germany and the German structures. What is very important to mention is that this event was previously planned within the Weeks Against Racism, the International Week Against Racism in Germany. And we were invited to participate, but since there were some rumors about our group being anti-Semitic, we were excluded, and we still decided to have this event just because it is a common thing to silence groups who criticize the state of Israel. We decided to maintain our event and raise awareness that silencing is a real thing within Germany. And by the end of this event, we will actually talk about Germany's role and why it is important to support the BDS movement and why Germany should participate in the International Israeli Apartheid Weeks. Okay, so as I said before, guys, just write your questions down within the chat, and by the end of the whole discussion, we will have a discussion, question, answer round. So I think here I would like to let Adila, who's a law student from South Africa, I would just ask you if you would just briefly refer to apartheid and what apartheid is and give us a brief introduction.
Sorry, my phone just went off. First of all, I just want to thank you guys for hosting this, despite the fact that you were turned away from the other organizations and things. I think that shows how important this situation is, the fact that we have to overcome that just to be able to be given a voice. So I really commend you guys for being able to do that. Also, I just want to clarify with my speaking as a South African in South Africa, I'm 21 years old, right? And apartheid ended in 1994. So I'm what's known as a born free, because my generation was born free of apartheid. But because we're in this country, we learn heavily about what had happened. We experience it because, believe it or not, the remnants of apartheid stem far further than when it ends. So that's basically what I'll be talking about. I just wanted to clarify it because it's not always first-hand experience. But just to start off the discussion, I want us to look at the actual definition of apartheid in very simple terms. Apartheid means separation. It means apartness. In South Africa, it was basically a concept that was formalized into law, into life practices, into education systems. Oh, also, please tell me to slow down for the translators if they tell you that I'm going too fast. Into our education systems and employment opportunities, all of that was influenced by apartheid to such an extent that even basic geographical limits for members of society depended on your race in South Africa. So in South Africa, apartheid basically evolved from just a concept to rather an ideology that was supported by our government at the time, which was the National Party, who introduced apartheid in 1948. They introduced it and said that it was for the separate development of different racial groups in South Africa, which is a very tricky and very intentional wording when they say separate development, because from that wording, it shows that coexistence cannot occur because you can only exist separately. And I think that that's what countries like Israel do to justify the fact that they are creating separate development, separate reserves, separate resources for everyone. They are creating that division and further perpetuating the cycle. But basically, the laws under apartheid in South Africa, under the apartheid regime, forced different racial groups to live separately and develop separately, and thus it resulted in them living in grossly unequal situations as well. I think to be able to apply this to Israel, because Israel is by definition an apartheid state, we need to see apartheid as what it is, which is any legislative or other measure that is calculated to prevent a specific group of peoples from participation in political, social, and cultural, as well as economic aspects of a country. In particular, these laws would deny members of a certain group basic human rights, right to the right to exist, like the right to a nationality, right to self-determination, and right to express yourself freely, all of which Israel does to Palestinians, all of which the apartheid government did to South African people of color. That's basically what apartheid is in theory.
Maybe it would be interesting if you would let us know how apartheid succeeded into the present, since because, usually people get the perception, since we are taught about apartheid in South Africa and within school, that apartheid is over, but they don't really talk about the aftershow effect, or are there still apartheid, like a mindset of apartheid? How is it present and how did it succeed?
I think when we think about the mindset of apartheid, we have to think about why apartheid was not only introduced, but why it was so strongly supported. Because objectively, from where we are now and the current frame that apartheid is in, it is an ideology that is grossly unjust and cruel. So I could barely understand how policies were introduced and supported by people at first, but then I realized that in how South Africa did it, which made me realize how like Israel does it. But in South Africa, the main reasons that apartheid succeeded, because it did succeed, was because of racial superiority and fear. Basically, South Africa used the fact that it's so easily accepted across the world that racism is influenced by the existence of racial superiority. That's why colonization happened. That's why we have just accepted Eurocentricity and Eurocentric values as what is to strive for, because that is what we were taught was superior and what we were taught was inferior. So South Africa used that, and another reason that the policies in South Africa took effect, which I think is the same reason that the policies in Israel took effect, is a very weak justification of the apartheid regime, and that is fear. So in South Africa, the white population was a very heavy minority. So they used the narrative of being afraid for their lives, for their jobs, for their culture, their language, all of that when they came into another person's land and oppressed them and treated them badly, which I think Israel has managed to do as well. They've warped this narrative of fear where they claim that they are in fear of the surrounding Arab countries, to control and hurt and marginalize people of the country that they are governing, acting like those people are not citizens of that country, like those are not their constituents, sorry. But I think what is different in this is that South Africa recognized that having a system that depends on fear as opposed to integration and acceptance, and overall tolerance doesn't work. And South Africa had to get to a very severe stage to accept that. It took so many countries turning against us. It took so much hurt happening in the country. And I don't know what more needs to happen, to be honest, for Israel to understand that it's not okay. Well, I do know what more needs to happen. BDS needs to happen completely. They need to be shunned from everything normal in our natural world, because apartheid is not a natural reaction to things. It's not a normal system. But that's basically why, and those two theories are why apartheid was introduced. And then why it succeeded, I think, in South Africa is because of our education systems and distinct separation. And I actually had to speak to a few people about this before I realized, because as I said, I was not alive at that time. But basically, the education systems were set up in such a way that if you are in white schools, and you are part of the superior group, you are being taught why you are superior. You are being taught justifications of why you're superior. You are being taught to dehumanize and minimize the other group's existence in your own mind, in your own way of thinking from such a young age. So that is ingrained in how we think going forward. And then the second part was distinct separation. And I think that ties into dehumanizing people and how governments tend to dehumanize people that they do not want to have as contributors. So in South Africa, like I said, apartheid had geographical limits for people. So Black people were not allowed in certain areas of the country where white people were, just because you didn't want them to interact too much. And Black people of color, if they were out past a certain time, but it was predominantly Black people, they had to have a pass with them. Like, it's called a dom pass. It was basically just like your ID, but you needed to produce that to any law enforcement, any white person that asked you why you're in this neighborhood. You had to be like, no, this is my reason to exist. And I think things like that, and things like checkpoints for Palestinians, things like walls for Palestinians, all of that contributes to dehumanizing these people, because you do not see their suffering. You just see them as these objects that are dealing with this kind of turmoil. You don't see that suffering, you minimize them in your mind, and then you're actually incapable of feeling compassion and of feeling empathy towards them. It's really messed up, but at the same time, that is how governments have succeeded for decades.
So you really interestingly touched on that, as one can see in South Africa's past, people were stigmatized due to their color and had to justify their existence. And I think Mr. Follett can here interestingly refer to Palestinians being stigmatized as the other within the Palestine-Israeli conflict. And why would you, Mr. Follett, because I heard your podcast last week, and there was also one episode where you speak about the second class status for Palestinian Arabs being, for example, differentiated from Jews who are Israeli. I think there are many things that one can compare somehow to Adila's input. Perhaps you could just start and introduce yourself a little bit more, and because I'm a big fan ever since I read your first book, and yeah, so I'll stop talking now.
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this. This is incredibly important. It's important everywhere, but it's incredibly important in Germany. And I can't believe that they denied you to be part of this important event regarding human rights, if I'm not mistaken, right? To deny the most defining issue of our time, which is Palestine, from a conference or events about human rights is unforgivable. And I promise you that they will look back at this and be very embarrassed that they did that. Because when Palestine is free, they're going to realize that they were wrong. There's no question about that. And also, before I answer your question, I want to applaud you and all the different activist groups that are working so incredibly hard on campuses and everywhere else to fight this fight. And of course, it's very difficult. Well, I know that in Germany it's particularly difficult, but you're on the right side of the issue. And when Palestine is liberated, you will be able to say you had something to do with it, and the contribution you make is a considerable, probably one of the most important contributions being made today to the liberation of Palestine is the work being done by activists like yourselves. And so when this is done, then you all, the administrators and all the people that stood against you are going to hide in shame in some corner, while you will be able to proudly say that you had a role in this issue and in the liberation of Palestine. So now to your question, well, you wanted me to introduce myself a little bit. So I grew up on the privileged side of the apartheid, of an apartheid state. And there are many aspects to that. One is that, first of all, you don't even see the other. Now, Palestine is a very small country, so how do you accomplish such incredible segregation in such a small country where the communities are really geographically very close? I mean, in an Israeli town, you're never more than a few minutes drive from a Palestinian neighborhood or Palestinian town, really. Not to mention the fact that so many neighborhoods and towns are actually built on the ruins of other Palestinian towns. And there's always houses, there's always, olive trees or fig trees or something that tells you that people lived here very recently. So how do you maintain that? Well, like Adila was saying, the education is very, very important to ingrain in young people the sense of privilege. In the case of Zionism, in the case of Israel, they don't frame it as race. They frame it as, well, this is our land and we've returned. They're the invaders. And of course, look at them. They're terrorists, they're poor, they're lazy, they're dirty, and so on. So while, a lot of the things that are said about Palestinians are said about other minorities and other racist societies, the way they frame it is that, this is our land, we're back. So we have a right, and we have a right, an exclusive right. And that's just the way it is. They're going to have to live with it. And thank goodness we're strong and we have a big army and we're smarter than they are. So we keep defeating them and we keep beating them at every war. And, the Arabs are kind of stupid anyway. We're Europeans, we're smarter. That's the narrative. That's kind of how this is done. And it's done very specifically through a very well-designed education system, but also the environment in which you live. The jokes you hear, the conversations you hear around the table. I grew up in a very, very Zionist family. I had a father who was a general. I had a grandfather who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. I had an uncle who was a president. I mean, that was the environment in which I grew up. So for me, Zionism is not something I learned in college or I took a course. I mean, I grew up in it. I ate it and drank it at the dinner table every day. So I know how they think and I know what they say. And I was part of that. I would talk like that too. I was talking to somebody just the other day about how Israelis believe that dogs hate Arabs. And so when Arabs come, the dogs begin to bark because they can smell Arabs. Incredible stuff like that, all these stigmas, all this nonsense, all this racist stuff that exists. But then I, was able to take the journey from the sphere of the privileged, on the privileged side of the apartheid to the other side, Now, geographically, of course, it's very near. In Palestine, it's just a few, half an hour drive or something, or less. But it's a big step because you don't go there because it's dangerous, because they're Arabs, because they want to kill you, because of all these things that you grow up hearing your whole life. But I did take that journey, and taking that journey is what led me to this realization that I need to make a choice here. Where do my values stand? Am I a Zionist? Can I support the Zionist ideology and the state of Israel, knowing that it's racist, knowing that it's violent, knowing that there are really no values that can justify it? Or do I stay loyal to the values that I believe in, which is that all of this is wrong, violence is wrong, and racism is wrong, and so forth. So you can't, if you support Zionism, you can't support human rights. If you believe in Zionism, if you're a Zionist, you can't. So I came down on the side of rejecting Zionism, which coming from
Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah,
I was just going to say this is a very important point, because our group as an anti-colonial is often referred to as being anti-Semitic once you're anti-Zionist, and once we would relate like there is a segregation wall within Palestine. I think it's over 652 meters long, and these are all apartheid structures within how the nation is built. Like we already heard about the colonial aspects of kicking people out from their homes and taking homes, ongoing deconstruction of Palestinian lives with the thing. How is it justified to say criticizing the state of Israel or being anti-Zionist is not being anti-Semitic? Because this is, I think, the main silencing method here in Germany. Once you raise awareness against human rights, against a state that oppresses basic needs like the freedom of movement, like within Gaza, as being labeled as anti-Semitic, because this is, I think, the main reason why Germany distances itself from the topic, or even shedding light on the Palestinian narration in the whole topic. How would you say is it justified to call Israel an apartheid state without really relating to being anti-Semitic?
Well, yeah, that's the $1 million question. This is the biggest part of the Zionist propaganda, and it began as soon as Zionism began in the early 19th century, when Theodor Herzl, who, by the way, spoke and wrote in German, defined Zionism. He immediately defined anybody who is not a Zionist as either anti-Semitic or not a Jew, because in those days, most Jews, the vast majority of Jewish people, opposed Zionism completely. And many Jewish people still oppose Zionism, actually. But Zionism actually is the main nemesis of Judaism. Not only that Zionism and Judaism are not the same thing, Zionism is the main nemesis of Judaism. It's the enemy of Judaism. If you talk to rabbis, if you talk to, Jewish people, by the way, or not even certainly the Orthodox community, but even completely secular humanist people who happen to be Jewish, Zionism is the enemy. Mm-hmm. Zionism is a racist, violent ideology that has stolen the identity of Jews and is perpetrating horrific crimes. But they knew that this was going to be a problem in the beginning, so immediately they defined any Jew who is not a Zionist as some kind of a non-Jew, and anyone who opposes Zionism must be anti-Semitic because they are the real Jews. So in other words, but to bring it back to reality though, supporting Zionism is supporting racism. Supporting Zionism is supporting anti-Semitism. I can't say it any more clear than that. Supporting Zionism is supporting anti-Semitism because it is racist. If you oppose racism, if you oppose anti-Semitism, you must oppose Zionism, because Zionism is a racist ideology that produced a violent, racist state in Palestine.
Can I ask a question? Sorry for interrupting. Just, Mika, you said that you grew up obviously in the privileged side of an apartheid state, and you had this revelation and you could see Zionism being conflated to a racist ideology. I remember we spoke about this in our talk last year, but how do we address people who have been so severely indoctrinated, specifically in Israel, indoctrinated with Zionist propaganda? Because to what extent do we blame these people, and to what extent do we expect responsibility? Because they weren't in control of it, and not everyone is going to have what happened to you. Not everyone is going to be able to have this revelation. So to what extent can we expect that, and how do we encourage that kind of transformation for people that have been so heavily indoctrinated, whose views have been like sheltered their entire lives?
Okay, that's another excellent question, of course. Now, if we compare it to Germany, for example, okay, now I'm not comparing Nazi Germany to Israel or anything like that, but all Germans lived under the Nazi regime. All Germans lived under this brutal dictatorship, right? If I'm not mistaken, Germans saved more Jews than any other European country, if I'm not mistaken, or it's a top 2 or 3 countries in terms of saving Jews. So the Germans stood up against Nazism, knowing that full well that they
als
could,
alle anderen europäischen Länder.
because they were living under the same regime. They could be sent to a concentration camp themselves. Not to mention the White Rose and all of these other groups that did exist, right? Israelis live in a free democratic society for them. Okay, look at the results of the Israeli elections. We've had 4 of them in the last 2 years, so it's very easy to see, right? The most racist, the most violent, the most vile politicians, people spewing just horrifying racist epithets against Palestinians, promoting policies that are violent and racist. Now, Israelis voted for this. If tomorrow morning 100,000 Israelis wanted to stand up and protest against the siege on Gaza, they could do it. If they wanted to form a political party that went against the grain and said, we oppose racism, we love Israel, but we oppose racism, they could do it. Nobody would go to jail.
So basically, they're not limited technically by their government. It's just
They're not
that
limited at all. They're limited by their own racist beliefs, by their own desire to maintain this reality. That's the problem. So the Knesset, the Israeli House of Representatives, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament is a reflection of what Israelis believe politically. It is a reflection because look, even now, this 4th election, the numbers were slightly down, but still Israelis vote in very high numbers. Yeah. So we know what they think because they vote every single time, you know? So, you know, it's such hypocrisy because in this particular case, Israelis can't say, well, it's not the people, it's the government. No, who put these monsters in power? Who's maintaining Netanyahu's grip on power for over a decade? Who brought in this vile creature, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a neo-fascist of the worst kind, violent and horrible. He's now a bona fide member of the Israeli Knesset. He's going to have an international passport, you know, a diplomatic passport. He can go anywhere. This man is a criminal, and he's not the only one. He just happens to have the most extreme, you know, he vocalizes his views the most extreme way. But this is Israeli society. This is the reality. Which is why, I'm sorry, I'll just finish the sentence, which is why this is the answer. Which is why BDS is the answer. Until that society is brought down to their knees and they realize they have nowhere to go. They can't go to the Olympics. I remember South Africa could not participate in any sporting event. It was a violation for any country to even invite South Africa. It was a violation of any sport, any cultural event, any academic. It was a violation to even invite them. That is when Israeli society will change. Only then.
I think what I was going to touch is actually your nice button, like the BDS movement, and how far does it help to prevent the apartheid structures, the ongoing oppression? Because here in Germany, like again, speaking from the German perspective, BDS movement was actually forbidden and was also labeled from the international counseling gathering of the politicians in Germany, which we would refer to in the German language as Bundestag. It was forbidden and stated as being an anti-Semitic movement. And what is crucial about the BDS thing, that many groups that, for example, I dealt with in university think that BDS is actually a group, but so they don't really comprehend that it is a grassroots ideology and that is more of a mindset. Perhaps you could elaborate, like, what is BDS? How does it help to like to put pressure somehow on the apartheid structures of Israel? And for you, Adila, perhaps what made you say and state like, hey, I support BDS? Because it took me, like, just speaking from my experience, some fear, like I was a little bit fearful to say, hey, I support BDS, just because with the news I heard like, oh, okay, it is somehow related to be anti-Semitic, but meanwhile now I comprehend why it's not. But perhaps we could shift the focus a little bit on the Meet BDS thing now.
Sure. Do you love to start? Go ahead.
Ladies first.
Well, so for me, like I always saw BDS as boycott, divestment, sanction, and I linked it to what happened to South Africa. We, as Miko said, we were excluded from everything, as we should be. We were a hella racist country. But it took the world literally turning against the act of apartheid in South Africa for South Africans, for the white population in South Africa to realize that this wasn't a sustainable system. Whereas apartheid in Israel and the occupation of Palestine by Israel has been happening for a lot longer than apartheid happened in South Africa, and there still has not been any severe step of boycotting, divestment, and sanctions. And I think for me, it wasn't just simple things. It wasn't like, oh, I'm not going to drink Coca-Cola only because they support Israel. It's just silly things like that. That counts, but it's also like the mental boycotting and divestment and sanction of ideologies that support this Eurocentricity and this acceptance of treating people badly. It's an internal thing of saying no to colonization and actively decolonizing one's mind and one's practices. I think all of that forms part of BDS, and I think that's why it became such an amazing movement, as opposed to just a group that advocates for something. It is a movement that all of us can partake in, no matter where we are in the world.
Yeah, I think the important thing is to divorce the whole issue of Judaism and anti-Semitism from Palestine. Because there's nothing to do with Judaism, it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, and certainly BDS doesn't. Now, apartheid is a well-defined crime. It's a well-defined crime. If anybody wants to Google right now, they will find an actual definition of the crime of apartheid. It is a crime against humanity. It has been defined in international law. Israel, I always say, Israel doesn't violate international law. Israel is a violation of international law. The existence of this apartheid regime, which is the state of Israel, in Palestine is a violation of international law. We're talking about a violation of human rights. We're talking about a violation of international law. We're talking about crimes against humanity. That's what we're talking about. And we're talking about a political entity that is engaged in criminal activity on a massive scale, on a massive scale for over 7 decades. This is not some small thing, and it's not something that you can hide. It's all well defined. An excellent book came out last year. It's called "The Palestinian Refugees in International Law." I wrote about it in my column in Mint News Press a few months ago, and it defines precisely the role of the refugees within international law and their rights, and also the role of the violator, which is the state of Israel and the Zionist organizations, and how much they owe and so forth. It's an excellent book. We're talking about a violation of law. It has nothing to do with Jews, non-Jews, Semitism, anti-Semitism. All of this is put into the conversation by Zionists who want to throw a smokescreen and say, well, let's talk about something else. And now we're all talking about anti-Semitism instead of talking about 2 million people living without water, 30-minute drive from Tel Aviv, which is, the big modern fun city that everybody lives in. 30-minute drive, there are people that don't have access to clean water or the basic most medicine. A child with a curable cancer will die in Gaza. A child living 2 kilometers away with the same cancer will live, because this one has access and this one is denied access. This one is an Israeli Jew and this one's a Palestinian. That's it. That's what we're talking about. Now, if there's any questions, any doubts about BDS as a call, you know, inherently as a Palestinian call, look at the demands of the call. Ending the military occupation. There's an international consensus about that. You know, the military, where Palestine is still governed by military, allowing the refugees to return,
releasing political prisoners,
and precisely, and the resolution 194, which calls for the return of the refugees, is the most, you know, is the one resolution that has been, you know, returned again and again and again in the history of the United Nations. And equal rights. What are we talking about? Jews aren't even mentioned in the demands of BDS. There's no question here. There's nothing to do. This is all to remedy the situation in which Palestinians were placed. It doesn't talk about hurting anyone, not the Jews, not anyone else. So this is, I understand, I think, how we need to conduct the conversation. And when they come at us with the anti-Semitism and the Jew, it has nothing to do with Jews. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It has to do with all these other things that I just mentioned. That's the conversation we need to have.
I think what you just mentioned, Miko, is really interesting, especially about apartheid structures within the state somehow denies the Palestinian refugees the status to come back, but rather, you know, keeps them in the exile that they live in. Because now, speaking to people about the Nakba, the catastrophe where 750,000 Palestinians had to leave their homes due to violence, due to actually erasing certain villages back then in Palestine, it now seems impossible for those refugees with the state in its nowadays conditions to allow Palestinians to return home, because I think the issue has grown so far that you have, as you said, Israelis being socialized with the understanding this is our homeland, and Palestinians living with the pain abroad of our homeland was stolen. So the apartheid structures within the geographical location by, I don't know, I think it was 2020, last year in July, where the annexation plan came out, and the colonial settlements are still ongoing day by day. I think I read that this year 60% more of Palestinian land was stolen than the year before, and we just have started the year. So how does BDS actually help to boycott the expansion of the settlements? Because BDS also has like economical influence, and I read once that it really has had an effect, but perhaps you could elaborate on, was there really a progression, or is it more about the mindset? Because as you said, and as we all here understand, it is, BDS does not even talk about Judaism. It talks about the rights for Palestinians. It tries to give the Palestinian identity a narration somehow, but yet people hear about it. You have all these states that support Israel in its existence, how it is now, by silencing all the other countries. But how does BDS, or how can people contribute to establishing BDS within their country, like here in Germany, for example? If we, like as our group, we support BDS, and it took us some time to figure out the details about BDS. But on an international level, how would that look like? What can people do? How can one join the program or spread the mentality?
Well, the first thing everybody has to do is understand it. And then they need to understand that this is going to be a very dirty, difficult struggle. Because, like you said, it's going against the stream. Everybody supports Israel. Everybody thinks Israel is the good guys and the Arabs are the bad guys, basically. You know, everybody thinks that Palestinians are terrorists and the BDS is wrong, and why are we targeting the Jews and so forth. So we need to have that conversation to get people to the point to realize nothing about Jews, nothing regarding anti-Semitism. Now, like Adila was saying, it's not about you buying an avocado made in Israel. It's about some bigger things. I mean, don't buy the avocados, don't buy the dates. You know, Ramadan is coming up. Make sure you don't buy dates made in Israel. Okay, that is important. But it's even more important to get to the point that Israel cannot participate in the Olympics. Now that requires organizing. That requires expanding the network. That it requires talking to people. That requires posting. That requires breaking the law in places like Germany and France and some other places. You know, that requires a real struggle, but it's the right struggle. So it's not easy. It's, you know, well, whether it's fun or not, I think we can argue. I don't know if it's fun or not. Some people find it fun, but the point is, you meet great people, and this is the right fight to fight. This is the right side of the issue. Now, sitting at home doing nothing is an option. Now, and again, like Adila was saying, everybody can take this to whatever level they want. If you want to just not buy an avocado, don't buy an avocado. If you want to start a BDS chapter, that would be even better. Mm-hmm. And then talk to your neighbors and talk to other campuses and talk to whatever groups you're part of, social groups or political groups, or even religious groups, and get this thing going, you know, because it is dedicated. It is the right thing to do. It is nonviolent. It is principled. It is remedial. It hurts no one. It only comes to remedy the reality in Palestine. And I believe that, although this is not officially part of the call for BDS, this will bring down the apartheid regime in Palestine. Mm-hmm. You know, when I was in South Africa, everybody I met, white, black, in between, and everything in between, said the same thing. BDS brought down apartheid. We now, which is why South Africans are so passionate about Palestine in general, because now they see it as their role to support and help Palestine. And when the question is raised, and I remember this because it was raised so many times, you know, is Israel an apartheid state? People in South Africa laugh when they hear that question. They can see it all the way from Cape Town, all the way to Palestine, that it's an apartheid regime. I mean, you have to, how can you not see that it's an apartheid regime?
Miko,
I have rights that a Palestinian doesn't. You know, it's
Can I interrupt you, Miko? It's actually funny that you mentioned that about how blatant it is to every South African who knows apartheid that is an apartheid state. Because even like in 1961, I think when the UN was taking a vote whether or not to like be against South Africa's apartheid system, Hendrik Verwoerd, who was our prime minister and one of the architects of apartheid, he dismissed Israel's vote saying going against South African apartheid, because he said, and I quote, "Israel is not consistent in its new anti-apartheid attitude. They took Israel away from the Arabs after Arabs lived there for 1,000 years. In that, I agree with them. Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state." That's coming from someone who's unashamed of creating an apartheid state. There's no reason to lie.
Right.
They don't recognize real.
And of course, the two countries had great relations. Very, very close relations.
Yeah, there's that.
It's ridiculous. Could one say that all the countries, because I think Israel misleads or has 56 international laws and 56 UN laws against human rights, and it was sued multiple times by different organizations such as Beit Salama within Israel itself. However, how is it possible that an apartheid state like Israel gets away with everything? Because we talked earlier about the concept of power, and I was just wondering myself, is it really just the alliance with being with the most powerful, the safest country within the world, which is Israel? Is that the interest with supporting, like if we look at Egypt and all the other Arab countries which started to have peace contracts with Israel right now, it seems so paradox being Arab and an Arab country, seeing them allying with Israel against the rights for Palestinians. Is it just economical interest, or what does motivate other countries to let Israel's right to exist in its state now with all the apartheid structures to maintain? What are the motivations for other countries to actually, ally?
Well, I think it's mostly political interest. If we look at the Zionist movement as a whole, starting right at the very beginning, at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, they developed a very, very strong and very efficient model of lobbying. They had the best, the smartest, people who spoke many languages out there, traveling around the world to speak. My grandfather, I have a poster here of advertising a lecture by my grandfather in 1922 in Kiev. They would go around the world and they would speak in London at Parliament. They would speak to politicians. They would go everywhere in the United States, and they would speak and with such passion. Now, they didn't look Jewish. They were very secular. In fact, they despised, religious Jews. They spoke many languages. They were doctors and professors and so on and so forth. And from that day on until today, over 100 years, they have been lobbying, and they understood something very, very important, which is that all politics is local. So they don't go to Washington, D.C. That's only part of the equation. They're in every city in America. Every city council that gets elected gets a visit, gets an invitation to come to Israel, paid for. All these very wealthy Jews who are Zionists contribute to a library here and a swimming pool and the symphony and all kinds of things like that. And many of them are Zionists. So how can anybody go against these wonderful Zionists? Look at them. They're decent. They look like us. They speak many languages. They're philanthropists. They must be good people. That's how they do it. And that's what they've been doing for over 100 years. And that's why they're so successful. That's what we have to work against. This is the battle. And to every decision, every local ordinance, every local law, as you know, here in the United States, they put in something about Zionism. They put in something about supporting Israel or opposing BDS now. That's the new thing. I don't know if you guys know who Abby Martin is. She's a great journalist. She's suing the state of Georgia because she was supposed to give a lecture at the University in Georgia, and they wanted to make her sign a pledge never to support BDS. Abby Martin, who was like, she's a wonderful pro-Palestine activist, So now she's suing the state of Georgia. So, this is the level of sophistication that they've developed over more than 100 years. This is why regimes, American politicians don't care about Palestine or Israel. They want to get elected. And I think this is true in every country. And in case of the Arab regimes who don't have to be elected, but they want to maintain their regime, they need weapons, they need connections to America, and Israel is the bridge. Israel is how you do it. So that's
what I think is interesting about how you mentioned the link with America and Israel. It's because they've stated that because it's not a shameful thing for them to see that Israel is their like democratic steadfast in the Middle East. Like that's their pillar of democracy in the Middle East, which is why they invest so much into it. And it's just really ironic, actually, that they view Israel as a democratic state when it has shown that it is democratic not for all people in the state. It goes against the principles of a democratic state by choosing to only see its constituents as Israelis, as settlers, as things like that. You're putting citizens out of their homes. That's not democracy. You're not giving them a vote. That's not democracy. It's very ironic that America can pick and choose when they want to bring up the democracy discussion.
I think also one can barely relate democracy to an apartheid state, just because thinking of Biden, who just before the election stated, hey, I am Zionist and I'm proud of it, and I'm giving that mindset to the next generation. And perhaps, Adila, you could touch on generational trauma, because me and you, we have been chatting in the past days, and you told me something which I really find interesting to share it. And maybe the next point after that could be, how is an Israeli Palestinian differentiated than a Jewish Israeli due to citizenship, which also is then again a form of segregation due to a passport or religion. But perhaps we start with Adila, and then Mr. Follett, you could perhaps answer the question.
So I think with generational trauma, we have to look at like what it's caused by. So generational trauma caused by systems of apartheid or systems of severe discrimination against a group that you are part of, let's say. It basically is something that is established by patterns in behavior regarding what someone has faced or what a community has faced. And through each person and through each generation, it's harder to heal from your traumas the more ingrained it becomes in certain communities. So in South Africa, we still have, like I told you, I'm part of the born free generation. We still have generations that are trying to come to terms with the fact that apartheid was set up where I was at a disadvantage, where my community was at a disadvantage. And like I said, apartheid in South Africa only lasted 46 years. And we are still going through such severe struggles when it comes to income inequality, standard of living inequality. I think we have one of the biggest disparities in the world when it comes to that. And that is because of apartheid, because apartheid is a structure that is very forward thinking. It is to divide a country for generations to come. It's not just for that specific time frame. And that's why whenever I talk about apartheid in South Africa, I do say how it was successful, because we are still recovering from it. And I think what is important to emphasize in that is that apartheid and apartness is not just a policy. It's not just a set of laws. It's an actual attack on the mental and physical existence of groups that are being limited in their power and in their authority. It's the indoctrination of one group being superior over another that's being inferior. Like in South Africa, as part of the addressing that, we have to constantly remind ourselves of Black consciousness and remind ourselves how important decolonization is, because those were concepts that came to benefit people that were not us. It benefited the minority. It did not need to be implemented. And it is a constant struggle. It is trauma that is passed down through generations, because your family members have reacted a certain way to the government has treated them a certain way, and you bear the brunt of it, unfortunately. Until there's an equal playing field, you bear the brunt of it, and there will not be anytime soon. I saw someone had a question about reverse racism in South Africa, but I think we'll come to that at the end. But I'll remind myself of the generational trauma. But I do want to mention that in Palestine, the trauma and the permanent damage from the catastrophe, the massacres, the checkpoints, the limitation of movement and determination of a people's existence, all of those are going to contribute to the gradual, but obviously the expected breakdown of a people. However, like the Palestinian people, they're just the most resilient people in the world, because they have shown us that their identity is not going anywhere, and it needs to be preserved and admired for generations to come, to prevent that like stagnation from their trauma. So I think the generational trauma of Palestinians could actually be combated by like the humanity of the rest of the world, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think what you also said is about the generational thing, is that a certain experience and mindset that you experience, you just pass it to the next generation. And if you raise or if you experience injustice, which is with the Palestinians, the idea or the ideology of coexistence within apartheid state under these structures is even more difficult. And I think I somehow forgot my question. Ah, yes, Mr. Pallet or Miko, how would you say is the Palestinian status or the passport? How is it differentiated from being a Jewish Israeli? Because we had a presentation about it, I think, in December last year, which was really interesting, but it is still a part of apartheid, because many people try to separate the imperial ideology or colonialism from apartheid structures, which is nonsense, because it all goes with one and goes together.
So the apartheid system that Israel established in Palestine has several parts.
Mm-hmm.
And Palestinians have been divided into different categories. Now, most of it is geographic. So their status depends on where they live particularly. So right now you've got, for example, you've got 2 million people living in Gaza. You've got 3 million people in the West Bank. They're living under this very strange occupation, military rule, governed really by the Israeli military. You've got 2 million Palestinians living who are citizens of Israel, but their lives are actually governed by the Israeli secret police. So they cannot apply for a job. They cannot apply to go to medical school. They can't do anything without going through the security system. Mm-hmm. You know, because their lives are completely governed by the Israeli secret police, which is, that model was taken from non-democratic states who want to control their populations. Now, they do have the same passport, they do have the same color ID, but they live in an entirely different reality, in an entirely different world. You know, there's so many different examples, you know, access to water, access to healthcare. Like you said, there was that webinar that I hosted with activists from within what's called 1948 Palestine, so Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel, and they talk about what it's like to be a citizen. It's an entirely different experience than the citizenship that I, as an Israeli Jew, experience living there, or any Israeli Jew experiences. It's a completely different reality. Mm-hmm. You know, there are certain towns where they can't even walk in. If you talk about the Nakab is the entire southern half of Palestine. The Palestinian Bedouins are not allowed to go into Omer. Omer is one of the richest Israeli towns in the Nakab. Palestinians are, if you walk around there, if you look like a Palestinian, you're going to be arrested, So, I mean, and again, access to water, access to roads, access to healthcare, home demolitions.
Mm-hmm.
You never hear of an Israeli home being demolished, Israeli Jewish home being demolished. Why? You think they never break the rules? You think nobody ever builds a house or an extension or a balcony or something without a permit? Everybody does. But they get a fine. They go to court. 10 years later, something happens. Meanwhile, nobody comes to demolish their house. In the last 3 years, in the Nakab alone, in the southern part of Palestine alone, there have been more than 2,000 home demolitions per year.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very poor community. When we say homes over there, these are usually very, not exactly mansions, although they do destroy mansions in Jerusalem and other places as well. But the entire existence of these so-called citizens is different, completely different. Now, the other category is, like you were saying before, it's the refugees.
Mm-hmm.
They're denied anything. They have no rights anywhere. When the state of Israel was established, it established an apartheid regime.
Mm-hmm.
These Palestinians, and today, of course, there's over 5 million with them and their descendants, have been denied citizenship, have been denied the protection of a state, have been denied the protection of the law, any law. They were completely kicked out and they can't come back. And citizenship was granted to people like me, to settlers.
Mm-hmm.
And, a kind of a quasi-citizenship was given to the few Palestinians who actually remained, but not completely, because many of them are displaced, internally displaced. So they're refugees, even though they're within Palestine, they're still refugees because their villages were destroyed, their towns were destroyed, and so on. So it's an entirely different reality. It is a textbook apartheid. And again, if you compare it to the crime, to the definition of the crime of apartheid, there's no question that Israel is an apartheid regime, an apartheid state.
I think it's also interesting to refer that Israel has an apartheid system within its apartheid structures, because as you just said, Palestinians living within Israel are not granted the same rights. And I think also one can see that there is a high number of police brutality and I don't know, is it like the settlers also attacking Palestinians just due to their Palestinian citizenship? And so there are apartheid structures within the structures, although to the outside world it seems like Israeli Palestinians are granted the same rights while they are not. Because looking at COVID, Palestinians living in Israel were the second group or even third group who were granted the vaccine. And just from my own family within Israel, I know that they didn't receive it, although media portrayed as everybody or everyone within Israel had access to the vaccine. And I think Palestinians have started to become some of the vaccine, but also another one than the one that Israelis are getting. So is it justified to speak within us? I don't know how to say, like, it's a apartheid structure within the apartheid system.
Well, I think it's all part of the same structure. And by the way, there's another group that I forgot to mention, which is the Palestinians who live in Jerusalem. They have their own status. We're talking about Palestinians who lived in Jerusalem, who came with Salah ad-Din 1,000 years ago. They're only alien residents, and if they leave, they lose their residency and so forth. I'm a citizen of Jerusalem. I was born in Jerusalem. Nobody takes away my citizenship or even doubts it, after 2 generations or 3 generations. So yeah, but I think what you mean is, or what you've described is actually that a lot of times people talk about the apartheid regime as though it only exists in the parts of Palestine that were occupied in 1967, in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That's a mistake. Apartheid existed in Palestine the second the state of Israel was established, because it established itself as a state for Jewish people in an Arab country.
True.
So all the rights were given to one group, but not the other, not the indigenous people whose country this was, but to settlers. That is precisely the reality that was established. So it's been an apartheid state from the very beginning. It defined itself. It didn't say the word apartheid because they're smarter than that. So they use Israel, which is biblical. They use Jews. They use Zion. They use all these terms that people think about the Bible. They think about And then people confuse the Bible with history, and they think the Bible is history, and you get into this mess, and that's why they're so successful. That's why they're able to sell this nonsense, because it appeals to people's, religion and emotion and things like that.
Yes, definitely. I think we somehow came to the end. I don't know if Adila would like to add something or Yumiko would like to add something. And then I would open up the discussion or question round.
I would just like to emphasize what Miko was saying about stop conflating Zionism and Judaism, because it's so difficult to communicate with someone who only wants to use religion as the basis of an argument, when unfortunately that is all theoretical, whereas practically in real life there are people that are suffering, there are human rights that are being violated, the UN has recognized it, there are treaties and declarations that have been violated. That's all real life, that's not theory. So there's no point arguing over theory and ignoring the actual facts in real life. There's no point arguing about religious rights over something when no religion allows dehumanizing someone and taking away their dignity.
Yes, definitely. I think that was a nice closing word.
Oh, thanks.
Definitely, just because you're right about it. Like, if you think about it, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was never about religion. You had, looking back at Salahuddin, even before, after Jesus, since I'm a history major, I went into the dive in of religions back then. Palestine was actually the place where religions, cultures, diversity coexisted, because you also have like all the Jewish Orthodox religious places which have to be differentiated from Judaism. It's like you cannot tell someone who is Shia being a Sunni or whatever. It's never been a conflict of religion, which somehow, as Yumiko said, people or media just use this advance of the complexity that present in such a small country, just to cause confusion, to let the human being lazy, trusting the media, and having this image without to go the step to decide being active or get clarification about everything. I think I'll open up the question just for everybody. We are collecting today a donation for this event, and I will drop the link in the chat right now. And feel free to donate whatever you feel like. I really appreciate, and I want to shout out here already before I forget, to our translators today, Jamal and JJ, who are translating into German and make this event bilingually possible. And I think I'll start with the questions in the chat. And everyone who has a question, I would like you to drop the question in the chat, so I can just read them out, because it would be a little bit too complicated to open up the microphones. Thank you in advance. Here is the link for the donations. So the first question we have is, just a second. Adila, what do you think about the ongoing reports of white farmers getting killed and attacked as some kind of reverse racism?
So when I saw this question, I was a little bit irritated, and I'm going to explain why. Because I think that when people bring up the situation of white farmers being attacked in South Africa, I'm so used to it being brought up in response to like negate or ignore a different human rights violation. And to be honest, the situation about the white farmers being murdered has nothing really to do with the Palestine situation. But I will say that it is an awful thing. There are farmers that have been like over 1,000 confirmed murders of farmers. But I don't think it's fair to make it a racial what's the word when you portray something as racially motivated only, because there are a lot of factors in it. And I don't think you can have it as reverse racism, because racism is part of to be racist, you have to be part of a system where there's systematic oppression from one group of another. And at this moment, there isn't that. We have like BEE and like trying to empower Black people and like people of color in South Africa to kind of even the playing field from what happened in apartheid, but we're nowhere near close. So I don't think that we can throw the term of reverse racism around very easily in this sense, because there needs to be a structure for that.
Thank you for the answer. I think the next question is very interesting too. Mr. Pellet, but why do Jewish people support Zionism and seeing anti-Zionism as racism or anti-Semitism? I think we touched on that, but perhaps the second part is interesting. What is the benefit of Jewish people supporting this ideology? I mean, not all of Jews, but those who live in Israel.
Well, I don't know. Why do people support racist ideas? Because they're racist. I mean, so Jews are just like anybody else. Some of them are racist, some of them are not, some of them are, they support it because they support it. I mean, like I said earlier, the efforts by the Zionist organizations around the world to educate, so-called indoctrinate Jews and non-Jews into accepting Zionism are incredible. I mean, you should see what happens in the United States. I mean, the big synagogues, the Israeli flags, the special classes in the schools that push this Zionist agenda, push the Zionist narrative in a way that it becomes the reality. People don't realize anymore that it's propaganda, that it's all built on lies. So that's why the people that are Zionists are Zionists. There's no other reason. There's education, and then there's inherent racism. But there's no way to justify it. It's just there's only way to explain it.
But perhaps it would be interesting to know, have you experienced within Israel a movement pro-Palestinians? Like, are there voices that can be represented that fight for equal rights?
Inside of Israel?
Mm-hmm.
Not among Israelis, among Palestinians, yes. I mean, yes, there are a handful of Israelis in the very, very fringe, that are considered radical and speak like I do. But it's a very small minority. Of course, among Palestinians, of course there is, but not among Israeli Jews. It's very rare. Yeah. I mean, there used to be what was called the peace movement, but it was a Zionist peace movement. And Zionism and peace, you have to choose. You can't have both. And they chose Zionism, so what was called the peace movement, of course, disappeared because they're all Zionists, and that's what they chose to be. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but were they talking about Jews in general, or were they talking about Israelis?
I think so. Here the question was about Jews in general.
Oh yeah, okay.
The next question is also for you, Miko. Many Palestinians boycott Israeli elections because they consider them illegitimate and waste of time, as token representation doesn't seem to change the power balance. Do you think this is the right strategy?
Absolutely. There was a call for boycott in several organizations within the 1948 Palestinians. Ibn al-Balad was one, and one or two others. Mm-hmm. And I support it completely. I think Israelis, I think anybody with a conscience should boycott Israeli elections. Number one, because Israel is not a legitimate state, so we should not participate in it. But number two, the last four elections were only took place in order to keep Benjamin Netanyahu in the seat. I mean, this was part of a strategy of Benjamin Netanyahu to remain in power. Mm-hmm. So he would create this crisis and go for elections, create a crisis and go for election. And that's why so why participate in this, So if you have a conscience, and then I certainly support boycotting the election, absolutely. And for Palestinian citizens of Israel in particular, because they have nothing to gain by participating in the election, absolutely nothing to gain. And they're legitimizing this apartheid regime that is only making their lives impossible to live. So absolutely, yes.
I think Mr. Rajab has a question. I will.
Yes. Good evening, everybody. I am Atiya from Palestinian Solidarity Committee in Stuttgart. I would like to welcome Adelia and Miko. I want to greet you, Miko, and we wish to see you again in Germany.
أهلين.
Alan, I have two questions. The first one, we know all that discrimination and racism and apartheid, all these are features of settler colonialism. Can we discuss deeply about settler colonialism and how we can overcome the colonialism and settler colonialism in Palestine? The second question is, how do you think, Miko and both, I think the question is for you both, about the one democratic state, excuse me, one democratic state solution. We have in Palestine a movement now. We are working on this idea, one democratic state for all citizens in Palestine. Yeah, that is my question. Thank you.
Oh, very good questions. Thank you for that. You know, the first part, how we fight settler colonialism, is by creating a single democracy in Palestine. So one question, well, the second question is the answer to the first question. You know, I think BDS is the bridge that takes us from this racist regime that has been occupying and destroying Palestine. And I think when we say occupying Palestine, people don't appreciate just how destructive it is. You know, monuments and towns and villages and people being destroyed, the culture being destroyed, erased, the history being erased, names of places being changed. You know, I mean, just violent destruction of a country going on for more than 7 decades. That is the reality, and that is what Israel is. It's violence, it's racism, and it's destruction. Mm-hmm. BDS takes us from that, you know, by struggling to bring that down and replace it with a free, democratic, decolonized Palestine, mm-hmm. which allows the refugees to return. That's precisely the structure that I think we need to be fighting for. We need to be talking about. One leads to the other, and then when we have a real democratic Palestine, and you know, the image that I always have is South Africa, of course. You know, when the clerk stood up one day and said, we are releasing the prisoners, we are unbanning the political parties and calling for a one person, one vote. That was the end of apartheid, mm-hmm. politically. And that is exactly what I envision happening in Palestine. It could be this prime minister, this Netanyahu guy, could be the de Klerk. I mean, de Klerk was not a saint. He had no choice. They were on their knees. They had nowhere to go. This was the end. He had no other way to go. And that's why he did what he did. So that's how I see this happening. Then you have elections. Then you have a legislature, a parliament that represents all the people. Then you have a government that represents all the people. Then you start creating the mechanisms to allow the refugees to return, to rebuild Gaza, to compensate and give reparations to Palestinians. Then you start the structure of decolonizing, you know, of bringing everything back, talking about the debt, the enormous debt that is owed to Palestinians, not only personally, but we're talking about, you know, entire agriculture products and fruit that were stolen by the Zionists, and cash that was taken from bank accounts, and cities that had, you know, public spaces, and on and on and on and on and on, enormous debt. Then you can start, you know, decolonizing, the process of decolonizing. But BDS and then the creation of a real democracy in a liberated Palestine is the path we go. That's how we move forward. Absolutely.
I'm just referring to the questions here. Somebody, Ona van der Heuvel, asked ICC question marks. I don't know if you're still in the chat, but what does, oh yeah, I see you, sorry. What does ICC stand for? Perhaps you would like to speak.
What is ICC, the International Criminal Court?
Ah, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, I would like to know, we've all been talking about ICC every day, every night for years, but nothing is happening. Why is Israel holding in? I don't understand why nothing is happening. I've been in the Palestinian cause for 40 years, and I'm still doing the same talk after 40 years. When are we going to have an issue? And why is the world scared of Israel? Please answer.
Well, I think we did. I think we did.
I know you. Thank you. Merci, Nico.
I think we did answer. But I think, you know, I mean, there is some movement in the ICC. I mean, the ICC declared that they're going to prosecute. I mean, that they're going to investigate. I'm sorry. The prosecutor said that there's enough reason to investigate, which is a big step. But you know, this is happening slowly because there's not enough of us. I think the more of us, the more we organize, the harder we work, the faster this will go. This is not going to come from, you know, from divine intervention. We have to organize more. We have to bring more people in. We have to talk more. And we have to remember that the other side is working against us all the time with more money and more influence and more people. So we're fighting an uphill battle all the time. And every success is measured in very, very, very small steps, because that is the nature of a struggle like this. That is the nature of a struggle for liberation, of a struggle against apartheid, against settler colonialism and imperialism. That's the nature of the struggle. But I do firmly believe that as we move forward, we have to grow. We have to engage more people. We have to learn how to convince more people. We have to bring more people into the struggle, because the more there are, and we have to make sure that we talk to our elected officials. Those of us that live in countries that officials are elected, we need to come to a place, and I know the road is still long, but we need to come to a place where nobody can be elected if they support Israel. That if you support Israel, you will not be elected. That's what we need to get to. That's the place we need to go. We have a long way to go, but that's where we need to go, because right now it's the opposite. Right now, in order to be elected in America, even to be elected to a city council, you know, you have to show that you love Israel, even though if you don't, then most of them don't know where Israel even is. You know, I think that's the struggle, but that's, I think, one big important segment, to organize to a point where they know they must support BDS to be elected. They must support. There's a governor running, somebody running for governor here in Virginia, not far from here, who just declared that they support BDS. He supports BDS. That's monumental. You know, Bernie Sanders didn't say he supports BDS, but he said that America should condition aid to Israel on its violations of international law, you know, human rights. They're not enough, but these are big steps. And none of these steps would have happened if it wasn't for the work of activists, you know, everywhere. That's how we get to this point. So if we had more and we worked more, then we would have faster results, I think.
I think this is very interesting. It's more about the trust in the process and the resistance than to lose hope and focusing even on the small progresses. Here's also an interesting question. I think, Adila, you told me some of your experience here. Is it difficult for all BDS members to enter Israel?
For some of us, it is. And I think it's because Israel is still being able to manipulate the intentions of the grassroots movements of BDS. They're saying that it's this anti-Semitic group, it's this hateful group, it's this destructive group. Why are they hateful? What are they hateful of? They're hateful of an apartheid system. It is very difficult to gain access to Israel if you are a BDS supporter. But as a BDS supporter, why would you want access to Israel? You should be boycotting them because they are an illegal state. I do think access to Palestine is important as a BDS supporter, but I think that will only come without like succumbing to the threats of Israel and to the limits that they pose on you regarding traveling and whatnot.
Sorry, my microphone was off. Here's somebody also, I think, Ona van den Heuvel, you asked where all the Palestinian politicians are here, and somebody answered in the prisons, which is perhaps, Mika, you would comment on political, but to some extent, if you're politically active within Palestine, you are imprisoned. And me here as a Palestinian speaking about Palestine even endangers me and my legacy to go back to Palestine. So it's not that unrealistic. But what do you know so far about the status of Palestinian politicians? Oh, sorry. I think you need to enable your microphone. Yes.
Yeah. Well, if they're not in prison, they're dead. I mean, if Nelson Mandela was a Palestinian, Israel would have assassinated him. Israel would never have allowed Nelson Mandela to continue to be alive. He would have been assassinated. And so Israel has learned from South Africa. Israel has learned from the Irish struggle against the British. Israel has learned a lot, and they implement everything they learned. So there's no question, if there was a Mandela in Palestine, he would have been shot. Now, if we look at the Palestinians in the Israeli prisons, you know, when we talk about a one person, one vote in a free Palestine, you know, there are thousands of Mandela, you know, of people who are very qualified, excellent people who will probably run for office. You know, there are lots of Palestinian political prisoners. I mean, then many of them are great leaders and have great ideologies of all the entire political spectrum, from totally leftist to totally, you know, religious Islamists. They're all in jail. Mm-hmm. So they cannot really function. When they do function, if they're on the outside, they get thrown back in jail. So in a free Palestine, again, when the prisoners are released, when political parties are unbanned, and by the way, the question about boycotting the elections, I would say boycott elections that legitimize the state of Israel. But once the system collapses and we have real elections, one person, one vote, post-Zionist liberated Palestine, then of course, and there's going to be a lot of people to vote for, because all of these great people will come out of jail and will be able to speak up.
Yes, thank you for the answer. I was just looking for the further questions. I think we are somehow getting to the last 3 questions, and then the whole interesting discussion is coming to an end. This is also why I'm not elaborating on the question, just to have a fair chance for everybody to pose their question. I don't know, Ryan and Alina, do you feel like reading out your question in person?
Sure, I can do that.
Hi.
Hello, I'm Ryan.
Go read your
question.
Yeah,
sorry. Well, firstly, I want to say thanks to both of you for giving this wonderful talk, Adela and Miko. Yeah, it's really wonderful that this is something happening, and we're happy to attend. So my question is for Miko Peled, but also, you know, feel free to discuss it amongst the both of you if you wish. My question is a 2-part question with small context in the middle. I'll just read it out. Are there any excellent studies tracing the internalization of Orientalist and other forms of imperialist worldviews into the construction of Zionism, both at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, and continually in the present? That's the first question. And then I go on to say, of course, when one looks at both how both Orientalism and imperialism have continuously tokenized, stereotyped, and essentialized the diversity of Jewish peoples into a monolith, whether in demonizing or flattering them, one could perhaps begin to see another angle of how Zionism not only is racist, being involved in colonialism as it is, but is in fact a very troubling form of anti-Judaism, being made to wear the mask of something Judaic. How do you see this mimicry and self-essentialism, which is ultimately self-abusive, perpetuated not only in Israel on the ground, but also around the world in the education systems of places like the United States, or especially Germany? In other words, how can we open people to tracing Zionism within the history of white supremacy to which it belongs?
Well, I think this is exactly how we do this. I mean, exactly what is happening now, hosting an event like this, bringing people to engage in the conversation. That's really what it's all about. It's about people realizing what this is about. And again, I'll say what I said in the beginning. I think the biggest contribution to this conversation, all aspects of it, and this is quite a, you know, this is quite a loaded, quite a, you know, complicated questions, but the bottom line is how we get people to understand what the issue of Palestine is all about and what Zionism is all about. And this is exactly how. the activists on campuses, the activists in the everywhere, actually, in all the different groups in the different countries, young and old, and everybody in between. And that's exactly how you do it. I think particularly activists on campuses have done and continue to do more for this issue. And again, all the different aspects that were raised in these questions, because they portray Palestine for what it really is. On the one hand, this very courageous struggle against all odds on campuses where the administration doesn't want them, Zionist groups attacking them. And they're out there explaining, talking about settler colonialism, talking about racism, talking about Zionism, and divorcing Judaism and divorcing the entire issue of Judaism from Zionism and this issue. Like I said earlier, Zionism should be in the same column as anti-Semitism because it's a racist ideology. If you're fighting racism, you should be fighting Zionism. If you're fighting anti-Semitism, you should be fighting Zionism. So I think the work, this is precisely how you do this.
So just not to interrupt this, I think, Ryan, you can propose a question now again, because it's, I think, related to this content, or you do not intend to say something?
Yeah, it's sort of a follow-up. Thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. That was really helpful, really insightful. The follow-up question, well, the reason I asked the question also is that here in Germany, the work that we're doing, what we've observed is that people are sort of conditioned to shut down as soon as Palestinian anything is brought up. So it seemed to me helpful to show people in Germany, for instance, that to support Israel is not only to harm Palestinians, but also harm Jewish peoples, the diversity of Jewish peoples, and other people around the world of conscience and of color and everything, So this angle of tracing white supremacy into Zionism seemed an interesting way to bring this discussion for people who otherwise are sort of blocked to understanding even that Palestinians are human beings because they're conditioned to shut down as soon as they hear the word Palestinian. So that's why my follow-up question is, do you, and this is for my own research perhaps, do you know any good readings that, readings or books or, anything that really looks at, in a nuanced way, the ways in which Zionism has been participating in a white supremacist version of Judaism, so to say?
It's not a version of Judaism.
Zionism, no, I don't mean version of Judaism. I mean a white supremacist manipulation.
Yeah, of course. There's, in fact, I have there's an excellent book called Holocaust Victims Accused. You can find the PDF online. And it talks about probably one of the most disturbing aspects of the history of Zionism, how they stood in the way of saving Jews during World War II. When other Jewish communities were raising money, were making efforts in order to save and help Jews during World War II, Zionist institutions stood in the way. And it's a very well-sourced book. Another book, if somebody's interested, if somebody has the ability to read, really read, it's a book of 1,500 pages. It's called The Empty Wagon. And it's by a rabbi by the name of Yaakov Shapiro. Mm-hmm. And it's designed, to be honest, it's a book for Orthodox Jews. So a lot of the stuff that anybody who's not Orthodox Jews is not going to understand. But the vast majority of the book can be very well understood by anyone. It's just, you have to be able to carry it. It's 1,400 pages long. It's very heavy. So, and Rabbi Shapiro is a friend of mine. So I always joke with him about this book that he wrote, but it's 1,400 pages of pure, the most analytic, the most well-sourced, every aspect of Zionism, and demonstrating in the most clear way. And again, it's written by a religious person for religious people. So for those of us who are not religious, some of the stuff may sound a little outrageous, but it demonstrates clearly how there's a clear and vast difference between Zionism and Judaism. Zionism was an attempt basically to steal Jewish identity. I think he calls it from identity crisis to identity theft is kind of the subtitle of the book. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very clear. He also has a podcast, if anybody's interested. It's called It's called, it's got a really good name, which I forgot right now. Let's see, Rabbi Shapiro, Committing High Reason. This podcast is called Committing High Reason. He and I interview each other all the time. We're good friends. But the point is that it's, it makes it very, very clear. And the first book I said, Holocaust Victims Accused, is painful to read. Painful to read, because particularly towards the end of the war, there were a lot of opportunities to save Jewish people from death, and many thousands. And the Zionists wouldn't do it because their basic thinking was, if we want to get a state, there have to be Jewish victims so that we can come back to the world and say, see, we have to have a state. So they wanted to see the Jewish victims pile high so they can point to it and then get their state. And it's very well sourced. This is not just somebody speaking, off the cuff. This is very, very well sourced with the names of the people and the times and the places and the meetings and so forth. So Zionism has a long history. And, and if you look at, I just wrote something, again, in my very last article in Mint News Press about the anti-Semitic origins of Zionism. I mean, Herzl himself, and from Herzl to Ben Gurion, all of these very famous Weitzman, very famous, very well-known Zionist figures were anti-Semitic. They hated Jews. They couldn't stand the things that they said. Jabotinsky, who was one of the founders of the Likud party today, they consider him one of their founders. The way they spoke about Jews, the derogatory terms they used, the horrible language they used to describe Jews. There's no question that this is a supremacist, racist ideology. And it's good to see the Jews coming out against it, Orthodox Jews coming out against it and saying, and they came out against it as early as 1900. I mean, the majority of rabbis as early as 1900 came out with letters and books saying specifically that Zionism will bring about violence in the Holy Land. It will create tension between and destroy the good relations that exist between Jews and Muslims and Jews and Arabs. And that goes to your point, Mina, you mentioned that earlier, the good relations that used to exist, and that it will cast doubt as to the loyalty of Jews. Mm-hmm. Because if you're a Jew and you live in Germany, are you a German or a Jew? And that's precisely what happened. All of these three things happened. Mm-hmm. And the loyalty issue continues today here in America and other places where this is brought up. So, and they realized this, and they saw this happening as early as 1900. So yeah, there's no question that there's it should be in the column. Zionism should be in the same column as anti-Semitism and all the other racist ideologies.
So I think this was very helpful because in the chat there were also some references to book and literatures. And although I had closed the question round earlier, there were more questions, but due to the time limit, I will read out the last two questions that were proposed. It's just due to fairness, but what I can recommend, guys, on our Instagram page, Palestine Anti-Colonial, I tagged Adila, I tagged Mr. Pellet, if there's something open, because some of the questions somehow go into more literature things, presentation things, you just can either look up Mr. Pellet's website, which is very helpful because he's often in webinars and the podcast. Many of the questions will be answered there. And so just a second, let me find that one question. I think one question was, what about the boycott from within? How can Palestinian citizens in Israel support BDS?
Hey, I see something here. Excuse me, Mina. I see something here about literature tips. Mm-hmm. Ibrahim Nasrallah, mm-hmm. The Time of White Horses. And also Ibrahim Nasrallah, The Lanterns of the King of Galilee. Again, these are very thick books. I like thick books. These are very thick books. They are historical fiction. And Ibrahim Nasrallah is today one of the greatest writers, period, and certainly one of the greatest Arabic writers. He's Palestinian. And both of these novels are sagas that are historical sagas based on the history of Palestine. I can't recommend them enough. And then there's Susan Abul Hawa. Her books are her fiction. I'm sure you guys know. If you don't know who she is, look up Susan Abul Hawa. She's written several excellent books. Again, I'm talking about literature. What was the question again about how somebody can
How
help?
can Israeli Palestinians within Israel can support the BDS movement?
Well, they do. Palestinians, there have been excellent movements within 1948 Palestinians from the very beginning, but they're always thrown in jail. They are oppressed. They are pushed down. They get fired from their jobs. I said before, Ibn al-Balad. Ibn al-Balad is a great. It's small, but it's incredibly important. Very, very important. And the people do what they can. I mean, you have to eat, you have to live, you have to drive, you have to have electricity. So when you live there, you live there. But there are ways, and they do participate as much as they can in boycotting in boycotting from within. Absolutely. I mean, there's already a movement, and this already exists, and it's existed for a very long time.
And I also think, I just want to add on to that, I also think that the onus in this situation isn't necessarily only on Palestinian people. The onus, I think, is on the rest of the world to be taking up the arms of like BDS. And Palestinian people show their support for the movement, despite them being like targeted for it, despite them being imprisoned for it. That's why like we were able to work with, BDS actually has worked with so many prisoners, like political prisoners and stuff, just hearing what they have to say and hearing what they go through and hearing how they see the country that they've lived in for so long. It motivates BDS supporters and the BDS movement from afar, because that is our onus. It's not on them.
I think that was actually the perfect closure. Adila, I think you were really great in summing things up. Just to summarize shortly, I think this was a very, very fruitful discussion. We had so many different topics. We had such an insight about a book dealing with Orthodox Jewish religion a little bit, which I highly recommend just to understand diversity. Many people fearing actually dealing with the topic of Israel and Palestine just because their lack of knowledge. And this is why I thank everybody for watching today and being here, because today's discussion, and actually each discussion dealing with Palestine, it doesn't matter if we're from Palestine anti-colonial, because we're trying to shift the Palestine-Israel conflict here to Germany to encourage people to overcome the fear of being labeled as anti-Semitic and to act for what is right, which is to support the human basic rights, where you leave out discussions of religion and everything that try to oppress us, things that have to be said. And just to speak about Palestine is already a step for progressing and going into the right direction. So guys, if you to listen to podcasts, again, I can really recommend all the podcasts Mr. Plaid has out there, the webinars. It's just very enlightful. You can always propose your questions. So in case you didn't have the chance, your question was read out there today, I'm really sorry for that, but I know that Mr. Plaid has an appointment and I have one too. So I'd like to thank everybody. Thanks for being there. Thank you for the nice questions. And thank you to Jamal and Janice for the translation. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening or day in the United States. And yes,
thank you, Mina. Thank you for everything, and thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye. Bye, Adila. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Bye, Miko. Thanks, guys. Bye bye.